I have been talking with Mark Carney for years now about getting him to join federal politics. I think he would be an outstanding addition at a time when Canadians need good people to step up in politics.
So, have you decided to run yet?
A wild hypothetical. Let's say the candidate wasn't part of the government. Let's say the candidate did have a lot of economic experience. Let's say the candidate did deal with crises. Let's say the candidate had a plan to deal with the challenges in the here and now.
You sneaky, you're running as an outsider.
I am an outsider.
I'm back home in Edmonton to declare my candidacy for leader of the Liberal Party and Prime Minister of Canada.
Mark Carney, if he won, would become the first Liberal leader who has never won an actual election anywhere, ever.
A big part of understanding Mark Carney's momentum among Liberals starts with understanding how people even know him to begin with. As the governor of the Bank of Canada, named by Stephen Harper's Conservative government during the worst economic catastrophe of a generation.
But today, former Conservative Prime Minister Stephen Harper called into question some of those credentials, blasting Carney, who he tapped to run the Bank of Canada back in 2008, for overstating his role in steering Canada through the global financial crisis. In a letter, Harper accused Carney of taking credit for things he had little or nothing to do with back then, asserting that the hard calls were made by former Finance Minister, the late Jim Flaherty.
At no point did Mark Carney work with Paul Martin to balance the budget. At least not according to his own resume. I mean, if he wants to call in and say, oh no, I had this secret thing that I've never talked about before while I was working for Goldman Sachs in Hong Kong, I did something.
From no job to one of England's top jobs, Mark Carney, Canada's top banker, is jumping ship. Though Carney said for months it wasn't the job he wanted, today he announced he is taking over as head of the Bank of England.
After repeatedly saying he didn't want the job, Mark Carney says the decision to move across the pond next summer was the result of soul-searching.
He gets a hero's welcome in Canada for his role with Stephen Harper and Jim Flaherty during the 2008-2009 financial crash. He doesn't have the same stellar reputation with everyone in Britain, does he?
If you're looking at reasons why the British economy has stagnated, why people's income per capita is now lower than Mississippi, which is the poorest state in America, I think a lot of the fingers can be pointed at the Bank of England. Huge amounts of printing money, too much inflation, diverting resources away from the productive economy, but also Mark Carney had a role in pushing the disastrous net zero agenda, which has been very, very damaging.
Perhaps with an eye on the future, Carney became vocal on the need for the financial sector to do more to tackle climate change.
I would say we're in a climate crisis, just like a financial crisis, where action needs to be taken.
And that will become his focus when he takes up a new post as the United Nations Special Envoy on Climate Action and Finance.
I think government has an important role in setting the direction for the economy.
Mark Carney is back from Europe.
Speaking as a European.
To continue what Justin Trudeau started.
A steady increase in the price of carbon. Carbon prices have been applied sparingly. They've been set far too low.
He even called Trudeau's carbon tax a model for others. So no matter what he calls it,
effectively a shadow carbon price or price on pollution,
you're going to keep paying.
With some form of carbon tax.
Just as I predicted, today Mark Carney announced that he will pause Trudeau's carbon tax until after the election and then bring in a much bigger tax that has no rebate.
I led global reforms to fix the fault lines that caused the financial crisis, worked to heal the malignant culture at the heart of financial capitalism, and began to address both the fundamental challenges of the fourth industrial revolution and the existential risks from climate change. I felt the collapse in public trust in elites, globalization, and technology.
You know, people will charge me as being elitist or a globalist. Well, that's exactly, it happens to be exactly what we need.
Hi, and welcome to the Candice Malcolm Show. I'm your host, Candice Malcolm. Thank you so much for joining us. We have a fantastic show lined up for you today. Now, let me start by saying this. Mark Carney is now 3 days away from being selected as the Liberal Prime Minister, despite never winning an election in his entire life. He's not a member of Parliament. He was not elected by the people, and he does not have a mandate to lead. And yet, lead he will, without any pushback from the powers at be. Carney is a self-proclaimed globalist and elitist, as you just saw. He thinks the planet is on fire, and the only way to put out that fire is by capping our natural resource development and further taxing and regulating Canadian workers. Mark Carney is a radical ideologue dressed up as a respectable banker. But the mask is starting to slip. So despite the legacy media's best efforts to prop up their golden boy and refrain from asking him any tough questions whatsoever, the more that we learn about Mark Carney, the more that we realize that something is not quite right. So today on the show, we're going to walk you through the many examples of Mark Carney misleading Canadians, spinning half-truths, getting caught saying different things and contradicting themselves in different part of the country, and saying things that are flat out not true. Now, none of this will stop him from becoming Prime Minister on Sunday evening, but maybe we can convince enough Canadians to look past the legacy media image of Mark Carney and look at this man with a necessarily skeptical and critical eye. And so I want to take this opportunity to promote a live show that we are going to be doing on Sunday evening. Sunday evening is the night that Carney will be appointed as Prime Minister. I predict that he will win the leadership race for the Liberals. We're going to have a live show. So join me and Cian Bexty. We're going to have lots and lots of special guests throughout the evening. Watch out for that live stream. We'll be on X, YouTube, Facebook, and of course on juno.com, junonews.com. And we will have that live show for you today. We're going to get to the news of the day as well, folks. We always do. And to walk through it with me today, I'm pleased to be joined for the entire show by podcaster Sean Newman. Sean Newman is host of the Sean Newman podcast, where they discuss issues related to faith, family, and the broader Canadian political landscape. Sean, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me back. Appreciate it.
You know, one thing that's happened in the news yesterday that I really want to point to is that President Trump has finally understood what is happening up in Canada. He finally saw through the game that Justin Trudeau is playing. He hit the nail on the head, and this is what he posted onto Truth Social. I wish that he had noticed this 3 months ago, but here he writes on Truth Social. He says, Justin Trudeau of Canada calling me to ask what could be done about the tariffs. I told him that many people have died from fentanyl that came through the borders of Canada and Mexico. Nothing has convinced me that it has stopped. He said that it's gotten better, but I said that's not good enough. It ended on a somewhat friendly manner. He was unable to tell me when the Canadian election is taking place, which made me curious, like what's going on here? I then realized he is trying to use the issue to stay in power. Good luck, Justin. Well, it's interesting, Sean, because I don't think that Trudeau has any hope of staying in power now. It's a little too late for that. But certainly the Liberals are using this entire issue to drum up support for their party, to scare Canadians, to divide them, scare them, make them feel like we're at some kind of an existential crisis here, and that the only thing that can save us is a strong anti-American party, and that is the Liberals. So I'm glad that Trump noticed it. I'm glad Trump called it out. One of the things that I appreciate about Donald Trump is what you see is what you get. So it's like as soon as this thing occurred to him, he puts it out online and lets everyone know what he's thinking. And I think he's completely right about this. What do you think?
Yeah, well, I mean, we got a lame duck sitting intending to resign, and I agree with you. I think he's done. But the Liberal Party certainly isn't. And they're trying to use this crisis, whatever you want to, what term we want to put on it, certainly to find a way to get Canadians behind a new leader, which certainly looks like it's going to be Mark Carney. And they got their bad guy in Donald Trump, right? Like it's interesting to watch Canadians with Donald Trump. You know, it's almost like he's our president. It's a weird thing, right? The divide is very real. You either really enjoy Donald Trump or you despise him. And they're playing off the people that truly despise Donald Trump and pushing him into, you know, I think he's been pretty clear with the government fix this problem and there'll be no issue. And, you know, has there been some work done on that? I would say more by the premiers than anything. And he isn't happy. Now, I don't know. I can't sit and act like I sit in these conversations. But when you watch what the Liberal Party is doing and how they're rallying around it and how they're positioning everything to be against Donald Trump in the next election, we've seen it in the polls, which is, I don't know, a bit shocking to me. Like, I would prefer not to have the Liberals there. I think there's a lot of Canadians that would share that sentiment. But that seems to be the way that the wind is blowing currently.
It's funny that you say that in some ways Trump speaks for us, because I think the majority of Canadians don't like Trump. They have a negative opinion of him. Even I've seen polls that show 50-50 split among Conservative Party voters. Half of them love the guy, half of them hate him. I don't think you can really be neutral about Trump. I think people have strong feelings one way or another. And I will say I don't agree with his economic policy. I don't like tariffs. I don't think they're a good idea. Look, if the purpose of the tariffs is to get Canada clean up its act and start spending more of our GDP on defense spending, crack down on drug cartels and illegal immigration, and get rid of a lot of the subsidies and sort of domestic protectionism that's been plagued Canada, and Conservatives and people like me have been criticizing this for like a decade or more, that Canada doesn't operate on a free market. If the point is to get Canada to do that, then I think it's good policy. But if the point is to just eliminate other taxes and live off of this world where tariffs are the new form of government, the way that government raises money, I'm not in agreement with him on that. But I will just say that I like his optimism. I like the pace at which he moves, and his willingness to just address issues head on, say what he thinks. And, you know, to me, I think that this is all deal making, and this is all art of the deal. Like, I don't think Trump is an ideologue. I don't think that he has strong views on like which policies are the best, but he just really likes making deals. And I think this is kind of the way that he's making a deal. What do you think?
Well, whether you think is right or wrong, you know, on how he's going about it, the art of the deal, you know, is exactly what he's working on. And the one that he points to over and over again is peace with Russia and Ukraine. And we saw it, like, I mean, we all watched, I think, and if you haven't, you really should go take the 49 minutes to watch him and Zelensky in the Oval Office go back and forth. And he since basically broke off talks because he doesn't think Zelensky is interested in peace. And Trump has said that now for how many months? Like, go back to his the race up to him becoming president, is that he wants peace. And peace means he has to deal with Putin, and everybody has their thoughts on Putin as well. And so there's a lot going on here that is more than just Canada. You know, certainly the tariffs are hurting us, but like, you know, like when you look at everything he's trying to do, I see a guy that's trying to get the world away from where it has been, and that is a lot easier said than done. You know, here in Canada, we have a whole bunch of things going on that me and you have talked about on my show and your show and on the live stream when you hopped on, that we all stare at. We're like, we're in bizarro land here in Canada. And I think Trump is starting, or maybe he's always known, but certainly he's starting to play his chips or his cards. Like, he's beginning to understand how much of a failed state Canada's become under a Liberal government, under Justin Trudeau specifically. And he's definitely rattling the cages. And the one thing that I find very interesting about it is how much it's dominating the conversation of Canada, which, you know, you always, I'm sure you are similar to me, that you want more people engaged in politics. And when it's quiet and there's nothing going on, everyone just goes about their day and cheers for Team Canada beating the U.S. in the Four Nations Cup. When there's things like booing the national anthem and tariffs coming in, tariffs not coming in, clean your act up, you're, you know, pointing to the Liberal Party doing this to try and stay in power. More and more people are talking about it. And that is fascinating to me because I think a lot of us in the independent realm have been trying to wake more and more Canadians up to get them in the conversation. Because as I've learned in my brief time in covering politics, is it's not a spectator sport. Like, it truly isn't. You have to be involved. You have to start to pay attention to these things. Otherwise, the powers that be will continue to rule over us in any way they see fit, which really just pains me sitting on this side, because I think there's a real opportunity for Canadians to grab back not only their small communities, but their provincial governments and their country as a whole. And, I guess in short or in long, is there's just a lot going on here.
Well, you're right that Trump is so busy, and we're so introspective, and we're so obsessed over little things that he said about Canada. But then you take a step back and you look at what he's doing domestically, all of his different priorities. I mean, he had his joint session, speech to the joint session on Tuesday evening, and just hearing him go through his agenda, you realize like how small and insignificant the Canada issue is to the Americans, and how kind of all-consuming it is for us here. Well, to go back to this idea that it is the art of the deal, and in the art of the deal, he says, throw out your most outrageous claim at the beginning, so that the other side gets kind of thrown off, and then you're more likely to get closer to your side in the negotiation. I think that is what this whole thing is. And interestingly, the Bloc Quebec law leader is coming out and saying this, and basically saying the same thing that Trump is saying. So here is Yves-Francois Blanchet. He says this in English, but then I'm going to play the French clip, because in French, he goes on a little bit more. So he says that he thinks that Trump isn't being serious, that it's kind of a fantasy that Canada will join the United States, but that Trudeau is cynically using this to mobilize the Liberal Party, using this as a political issue, and basically we shouldn't let Trudeau get away with this. So let's play this clip.
I don't think President Trump is really intending to try and annex Canada. It's just a kind of a fantasy, but I don't think he really believes that. In any case, it won't happen. But when Mr. Trudeau used that to mobilize Canadians, well, actually, I thought it was somewhat extraordinary that he was really trying to mobilize Liberals.
So that's exactly right. And we did get some good news yesterday, Wednesday, March 5th. The President Trump's press secretary announced that there will be a 30-day reprieve from tariffs for automakers under the free trade deal. So spokeswoman Carolyn Levitt made that announcement that there will be an exemption for General Motors, Ford, and Stellantis. So some good news, but again, until we address the underlying issues I think that Trump has raised with regards to the border and fentanyl and those operations, Canada's weaknesses that we haven't addressed under the Trudeau government, I think that probably they will still be coming. I want to show what the premiers are up to as well, because I'm not a big fan of Doug Ford, Ontario Premier, as you know, because I was on your live stream on election night and you heard my criticisms of him there, and the audience knows as well. But I think that when he goes on President Trump's favorite news channel, Fox News, and appears in an interview with Brett Baier, he is doing the job that the Canadian Prime Minister should be doing, right? We see Justin Trudeau going out onto MSNBC and CNN, these left-wing outlets that you know that no one in the Trump administration is watching that. Whereas when you go on Fox News and you talk directly to the people, I think this is much more effective. So here is Doug Ford making the case for a greater union between Canada and the United States. He calls it AMCAM, and saying that China is the problem, not Canada. Let's play that clip.
I do not understand why he wants to attack his closest friend and his ally. He should be focusing on China. He should be focusing on China with the autos that are coming in that don't comply with the USMCA. We're your closest allies and friends. We're your largest customer in the world. And we want to build the AMCAN fortress. That's the best thing to do. As he's focusing on his friends, China's just moving up every single day.
So I think that's the most effective message for Canada at this point. What do you think?
Well, if I can hop back to the Quebec leader first. One of the things, like art of the deal or not, right? Throwing things out that he's not going to follow through or not. One of the things that I don't think politicians get is by throwing out those, started a conversation here in Alberta that you'd asked me about the first time we talked, like is Alberta really interested in independence and etc. And at the time I was like, there's a small contingent, kind of thing. What Trump has done, and what I don't think most Canadian politicians get, and if they do, they certainly don't acknowledge it, is that the conversation has begun, and it's begun in a large way. We saw Jeffrey Rath talk about leading a delegation down to Washington to discuss a deal about Alberta becoming the 51st state. Because the first thing that happened in the conversation about Canada becoming the 51st state I can speak for Albertans out here. They went, why the heck would we do that? We want to have a voice. We don't want to be lumped in with everyone. We want a voice. And so you learn real fast out here that the 51st state idea, yeah, it might, like, overall, why would Trump want to add in a left-leaning voting demographic? That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. That's going to go more into, let's call it, woke world than the way he's pulling. So that gets solved in the first conversation we had. The next conversation that starts is, what would it actually look like if Alberta became independent, became the 51st state? And what you find, and I've found since our last chat, is I'm like, holy crap, there's a lot more Albertans that are interested in this idea than I had previously thought. It kind of surprised me a bit. But I mean, it shouldn't shock us. Quebec's had its own referendums on separation. And so the sentiment is there. It's always underneath kind of the prevailing narrative. And what this conversation has sparked is little cracks in it, to where Jeffrey Rath's clip is going viral all over the place, to the point where he's going to lead a delegation down to Washington. And I'm told, like, everybody wants on the plane to go. And I'm like, that's interesting, because if he comes back, just play the scenario. Maybe he goes down and talks to nobody, okay, and it goes nowhere. On the flip side, what if they get to talk to somebody and they go, listen, we'll give you, like, just from the economics of it, we'll give you the American dollar, just for simple. We'll transfer your bank accounts and they'll be all American dollars immediately overnight. I have no idea if that's possible. But, like, there isn't a person sitting here that isn't going, well, that's like 30% more money in my pocket as I sit right now, just from an economic standpoint. And I'm finding more and more, the longer this conversation goes on, the more this conversation is starting to heat up. And, if we get in a true all-out trade war with the United States, I can say from the Western side, what's happening is this conversation is picking up steam. It's everywhere I go now, it's the conversation of topic. And, the politicians can say, oh, we're going to do this and we got to explore different markets. Well, we've been saying this for how long? They talk about Energy East, in one breath they're like, oh, maybe we should do that. And the next, Quebec goes, no, we're never doing that. It's like, well, this has been the problem with Canada for a very long time. Danielle Smith says we got to open all the ports. If they're going to shut us off, we got to go. Well, we should have been doing that anyways. And so I think there's a growing conversation happening here, at least in Alberta, that is an offshoot that, a couple of weeks ago when I was on the show, at the time I was like, yeah, there's a little bit of talk, but that isn't that big. It's growing. And the longer this goes on, it's only going to grow more. If Jeff Rath actually takes a group of people down there and they actually get to sit and talk to somebody within the administration that can sit and be like, well, we could maybe do this and this and this. Sure, there's going to be legal ramifications that Canada's not going to want any part of that. But from an Alberta citizen standpoint, I think people are interested in hearing what the deal is. And does that transform a deal that Canada has to offer Alberta or other provinces? I think that's a big part of this conversation that politicians are missing.
It's super interesting that you say that. Yeah. So Rachel Parker had this interview that just completely went viral, and all of a sudden big American accounts like Charlie Kirk were promoting this idea. Now, I don't know that a citizen who's a lawyer can actually negotiate on behalf of a province, because I have Danielle Smith, who came out pretty strong yesterday. I would say this is the strongest language that I've heard from her, saying that basically that Alberta is willing at this point to take measures to go against these tariffs. So I want to play first this clip of Danielle Smith yesterday saying that Alberta's Trump card, no pun intended, is our oil. Let's play that clip.
I also want to point out that Canada has a secret weapon in this trade conflict with the United States, a Trump card, so to speak. And it is located directly under our feet, and it is called Alberta Energy. Whether the U.S. president wishes to admit it or not, the United States not only needs our oil and gas today, they are also going to need it more and more with each passing year once they notice their declining domestic reserves and production are wholly insufficient.
And then further, I'll just play the second clip of Danielle Smith. This clip was going viral online yesterday. The American account Libs of TikTok shared it. But this is Smith, Premier Smith, sounding pretty firm, saying that she has directed her cabinet to ensure that basically Americans are no longer able to pay for procurement. They're not able to be involved in no American alcohol will be able to be purchased, no video lottery terminals as well. So let's play that clip.
I've directed my cabinet to alter our procurement practices to ensure the government of Alberta, along with our agencies, school boards, crown corporations, and all Alberta municipalities, purchase all needed goods and services from Alberta companies, from Canadian companies, and from countries with which Canada has a free trade agreement that is being honoured. Second, no further purchases of U.S. alcohol or new VLTs will be permitted through the AGLC until further notice.
So what do you think of the Premier's new tone that she's taking?
Well, I want to first say about the citizen, do they have any capability to go down to the U.S.? I want to remind us in this conversation, we're about to have a prime minister who wasn't elected. So we're going to one way point out that a citizen can't go down and represent the views of some Albertans, but we're going to have an unelected prime minister negotiating with the president of the United States. That makes zero sense.
I agree. I'll just go back at that, because when people were criticizing Kevin O'Leary for being an unelected person going down, he just said, look, I'm a free citizen. I can do whatever I want. But I think that's different than going down to try to negotiate some kind of a annexation. Yes, there's a percentage of people in Alberta who are interested in this, who want to find out more. But I don't think that gives this delegation any power to start saying, like, this is how it could go and give us the US dollar, etc.
I 100% agree, right? Like, I agree, but our country is weird. And I don't know how better to say it, Candace. Danielle Smith, who we just showed, and I told you this last time, like, she became the premier of a province and was never elected to do so, right? She won a leadership race after Canning was pulled out, and she became the acting chief of a province. We're about to have the same thing happen as a country. And I feel the sentiment that is growing more and more and more is that the voices of the public are being heard less and less and less. And so they're starting to take things into their own hands. So while I agree a delegation going down has no real power to enact anything, okay, they're still free to go have the conversation, and they're still free to bring back the information. And that information is going to do lots of things that I cannot predict, honestly. And, Danielle Smith is talking tough now. She's we're beginning to enter a trade war when you're pulling off things. And what's Donald Trump going to do with that? Well, I don't see him backing down. The thing I just saw is that he's going to revoke, I forget the number, is it 240,000 or is it 270,000 Ukrainian refugees' visas into the United States? Like, this isn't a man that I see taking that lightly. And so does this escalate? It looks like it's going to. And what does that mean for Canadians? Interesting days ahead. I can use probably a few other ones. It's just that the delegation, it's like, no, I agree. Like, they don't have any, they're not elected to do that. But I might point out the most outspoken province in the country had an unelected official be put in, and now she is elected and she's won her seat, and I have nothing ill to say there. But we're about to have a prime minister who isn't elected, who's as tied to the WEF and globalist as humanly possible. And I think everybody's looking at that going, is there a way this guy gets in? If there is, it's probably on the citizens now to start having more and more conversations to force some of these politicians' hands, because we can't just act like Carney getting in isn't a big deal. That is a big deal. We should have had an election, but we haven't. And now, like when Trump goes, when's your election? And nobody knows. I laugh at that because we don't. We actually have no idea. And there's a lot of different dates thrown out on when that could be, but we don't know. We have no clue. Everybody's waiting for Carney to get in because we assume that's going to happen. Then we're waiting for prorogation to end. Then we're waiting for his throne speech, I assume. And you can correct me if I'm wrong here. And then we assume there's going to be a vote of no confidence. We assume. But we actually don't know that all these things are going to transpire and that things before then aren't going to change. And there's just a growing sentiment of, what are we doing here? What are our politicians doing for us? And we need to figure this out. And I guess there isn't that much faith left in the politicians to figure it out.
You're right about so many things, and I feel like the situation is it's such a hostile situation. Like, we don't know what's going to happen, and it's hard to predict because Canadians are like we're dealing with this crisis of cost of living, right? Young people are being completely blocked out of the housing market. Everything is so much more expensive as a result of Trudeau's policies. I can name a few: the printing of money and overspending during COVID and beyond, mass immigration that's just made everything so much more expensive because there's so many people trying to get houses and there's a limited housing supply. And then also, of course, the carbon tax that just puts extra tax on everything throughout the supply chain. So all of those things together compounding.
Carney's going to call it a shadow tax. He's just like, you can't up, except he's literally saying it to all Canadians. And you're like, what is going on? When are we get some common sense in there? And I think for a lot of us, we just assumed Pierre was going to get in basically in April. That's what we assumed a few months ago. And so much changed since then. My hope is that things are going to change real fast.
Well,
but how much I put, I'm not staking my life on that.
I mean, things could change, right? Like, if Carney, all those things happen, and then he looks at the polls. There was an Ipsos poll that came out last week that had him 2 points ahead for the first time in 4 years, a Liberal up ahead. You think maybe they'll trigger an election. This is as good as it's going to get. Carney's in his honeymoon period. The media refuses to give a critical eye on him and his background, his policies, and his many contradictions. Maybe he'll go for it. But then, Sean, there was another poll that came out this week that shows the Conservatives are actually way ahead. And maybe that's a reflection of of Canadians finally kind of taking a look at this guy and saying, well, wait a minute, he didn't do very well in the debates. He doesn't speak French very well. And like, we're going to go through it later in the show here, but there's example after example after example of him contradicting himself. Now, I want to get to these election rumors that are swirling around. So Brian Lilly, who is a senior political correspondent for the Toronto Sun, he's in the know. He knows everybody. And he wrote this on X. He says, a couple things I'm hearing. Carney and his new smaller cabinet could be sworn in as soon as March 11th or 12th. Lots of speculation of a quick election call. I previously said March 16th, voting day, April 22nd, but some think a week or two later. Some spooked over bad press for Carney over the past week or so. An internal debate is still going on. Over going early or later is raging. And then we have Marty up north, who was on the program earlier this week. He writes this on X. He shares a text message that he got from somebody that says, hey, Marty, just talking with my brother, who's a 30-year employee and captain with Air Canada, looks like we are likely getting a federal election mid-May. He says charters have been booked and a call out for crew to fly Air Canada wide from early April to mid-May. He says the only time this happens is for federal elections. So, I mean, nothing's probably decided yet and there's no way to know, but it seems like we might be heading towards an election right away, which at least would give some legitimacy. Now, I don't want to put too much fear out there, but the one thing I am worried about for Albertans and for the unity of our country is if Mark Carney wins. If he manages to pull the wool over everyone's eyes, legacy media does what the legacy media does, which is completely whitewash and make him look good in every light and spend all their time criticizing the Conservatives. And if the Liberals manage to win with the record of the past 9 years and with Trump offering Alberta possibly something different, I don't know. I think at that point, it might be a different conversation and more Albertans may be willing to hear from that. What do you think?
Well, first, on the flights being booked, on Brian Lilly's post, I once had Tom Korski on from Blacklocks, and I think Tom Korski is as connected as anyone. And he said, he told me 6 months ago, when you look at what's happening, this only happens before a federal election. So anytime I hear that statement, I'm like, okay, well, I've been hearing that over the past 8 months, and every time it comes to pass, and it never happens. So forgive me to your audience for being skeptical of anything at this point. I don't trust any of it until I hear there's an election being called. So until that happens, I don't care. I'm waiting to see if an election's called. In the off chance that Eastern Canada votes in Mark Carney, I will tell your listeners, the separation, independence, whatever we're going to call it, movement in Alberta will go supersonic. Like, you cannot tell me what we have lived through in the last 10 years under this Liberal government, if they're elected again, you want unity in this country, that is not going to bring it. That's going to do the complete opposite. If I can change my mind in a 2-week period of talking to you of like, I don't hear that much of it. Now everywhere I go, hear more of it. And then it builds to where Carney is possibly the Prime Minister of Canada for a 4-year stint. Yeah, no, it pains me to say because I love Canada, but that conversation is going to go supersonic. It's going to go through the roof because Albertans are already frustrated. And I think they see some hope in the horizon, but that horizon was an illusion, and it just keeps getting pushed down the road and pushed down the road and pushed down the road. And until there's an election and we see what Eastern Canada is going to do, I don't know if there can be any talk of unifying Canada at this point. Like, you got to get out. Fancy socks. Okay, he's out. Now we're going to have Mark Carney, who talks about being a globalist and a WEF and everything. And that is a possibility. We're even having this conversation where it's a possibility. It's just, I don't know. It's the most frustrating thing on this side. I hope the polls don't show the sentiment of Eastern Canada. I know a lot of people out there. There's a lot of wonderful people. It's just when you look at how the voting is going to go, we all know it here. We have to wait and see what that side of the country is going to do. And that's going to dictate where this goes. And so when you see the polls start to shift, you're like, there's no way. Like, this can't happen. And yet, I thought the same thing, honestly, in 2021, and then it happened. And so here we are in 2025. Everyone's like, well, these signs say there's going to be an election. I say BS until it actually happens. I do not trust any of that. And I feel like I'm becoming more and more frustrated the longer this conversation even goes around. Like, I can't believe I watch your, if that video of what you showed at the start of this show, if every Canadian's seen it, I'm like, how would he ever get voted in? It's the most laughable thing in the world. And yet somehow, and partly to do to what you're talking about with media and how they frame it, this is a large chunk of that discussion. And it's very frustrating on this side.
Well, it's interesting that you say that because the media has made efforts to paint Mark Carney in a certain way, right? They paint him as this like stable hand who's always been there for the crisis. He's a respectable person. He's incredibly impressive. Like, look at how nice he is. But that's not showing the full side. And I want to spend a bit of time now, Sean, to show Canadians the other side, the side that they might not see on the CBC. So I'm going to start with Tuesday evening in Calgary. Mark Carney was doing a fundraiser trying to make money off of wealthy bankers in Calgary who want to meet the future prime minister. And this is just indicative of his attitude because he will not let anybody from the independent press into the room. You had the Weekly Standard trying to get in the front door. I think we have some footage of that. And even though they had registered, even though they have a respectable journalist there, someone who has interviewed many, many politicians, just saying, sorry, you can't come in. You're too much of a risk. We can't allow you anywhere near Mark Carney. The same thing has happened over and over again. Let me just point out, True North's Noah Jarvis drove out to Oakville, Ontario, which is a suburb of Toronto. Very polite, well-mannered young man. Noah not allowed in, rejected from the event. Again, he had mild-mannered questions that he wanted to ask the future prime minister, but because he doesn't work for government-funded media, they just wouldn't even let him in the door. Same thing happened to Isaac Lamoureux of True North up in Edmonton for Mark Carney's campaign launch. Exact same thing, wouldn't let him in the door. Well, this time around in Calgary on Tuesday, we sent Juno News' Cian Bexty because Cian doesn't take no for an answer, and Cian finds a way to get in the face of a politician, or as close as they could get, because of course there are RCMP thugs surrounding this place. No disrespect to the RCMP. I shouldn't say thugs. RCMP officers who have been paid by Carney and his thugs to keep the press away from Carney. No skeptical questions allowed. So play this clip. This is an exclusive. Cian Bexty confronting Mark Carney, trying his very best to get a question in, and you'll see how it goes. Let's play that clip.
Mr. Carney, why did you lie about moving Brookfield's headquarters to New York? How can Canadians trust you to stand up for this country when you lied about such simple things? Why are you using police resources to help yourself get elected, Mark? Mark, why did you lie?
So that's as close as they're going to get let an independent journalist get to the future King of Canada, the future Prime Minister. And I think that's a problem. I think when you are that scared of asking, I mean, Kean Bexy's questions were perfectly reasonable. Like, why did you lie about Brookfield, right? These are questions that Canadians deserve to know the answer to. And as you can see, they just have absolutely no interest. And let me just point out, Sean, that True North is a qualified Canadian journalism outlet. What does that mean? It means that they applied for a status through the Trudeau government to register them as real journalists. This was a big fight over the last few years because Trudeau came up with these designations. They're not fair. They shouldn't exist. The government shouldn't be in the business of determining who's a real journalist and who isn't. But regardless of what should be, True North went through the process and they were approved. Even with the cards stacked against us, we got approved. True North is approved. So we are a journalist in the eyes of the Canadian government, in the Trudeau administration, the Trudeau government. And even with that qualification, they still won't let us in. It's outrageous. What do you think?
I just say look at history, right? What other countries did that and fund governments, fund media and silence people? And I mean, this is one of my frustrations at an all-time high. To me, do you want a leader who addresses the questions? This is why I got all the time in the world for Danielle Smith, because she'll take some heaters at her head, to use a baseball reference. And, you can love or hate her answer, but she's going to try and answer it to the best of her ability. Now, there's a whole conversation on the side of Danielle Smith that people love and hate, okay? But at least she's willing to answer questions and bring the audience in and have the media come. And when you look at the leadership federally, this has become the trend. I don't know why this shocks anyone. It doesn't shock me. It's more of the same, if not worse. And I go, if you're in Eastern Canada, this shouldn't even be a question of this guy getting in. Like, this guy should not get in. But he is going to get in because of a loophole in how our country's ran. Like, as soon as your leader of the country resigns, it should trigger an election. Side note. That should happen. But regardless, I'm just an angry Albertan, I guess. When you look at what he's doing, if you vote this guy in, this is going to be the way it is. And it's only going to get worse. It ain't going to get better. He isn't just doing this for show and then he gets in and all of a sudden he becomes, True North, come on in. Trudeau News, come on in. We want to have you. Sean Newman's in the audience. What question do you have? No, that isn't the way this is going to go. It's only going to get worse. When he jokes about, and I know he's not even joking. I can't believe he said it out loud. When he's talking about the carbon tax and becoming a shadow carbon tax, so we can't criticize it and know what it's doing, right? Like it's just everyone can see. I don't even have the words anymore of how frustrated I am that we're sitting here into 2025. We don't know when an election's coming. The fact that it was an American, Brian Lilly pointed it out, but I argued with an American over it because I didn't think it was possible to push an election to 2026. I'm like, that's impossible. No, it has to be this. I've read a bunch on it. And then, the more you dig on it, you're like, that is crazy. That'll never happen. But I go, I don't know, unless we demand something, there's a lot of things that can happen and are beginning to happen that honestly just unnerve me. I'm sitting where I'm sitting right now with my family and my life. I'm surrounded by great human beings, but our country as a whole, to keep it united, to try and keep it as Canada, you can't have 4 more years of Carney. That is an insane. I can't put as many exclamation points behind that word idea. It's an insane idea.
I completely agree. I think that we're charting some dangerous territories. And the list is growing, Sean, of the examples of Carney just flat out contradicting himself. I don't want to belabor this too much. We've covered it on the show. So in early February, Mark Carney is out in Kelowna, British Columbia, speaking to supporters. And he says that they are going to do everything they can to accelerate major critical infrastructure projects like pipelines, even use the emergency powers if necessary. And then just 2 days later, he's on French CBC saying that he would never do that. He would never force a pipeline on Quebec. Never, never, never. Total contradiction. media is okay with that. Next, he said that he was offered a cabinet position in the Harper government, that Harper tried to recruit him as finance minister. Well, Harper's former director of communications, Demetrius Soudis, basically just said that didn't happen. Okay. So here, yet another example of Mark Carney exaggerating. Then he says that he claimed that he was the one that came and helped Paul Martin, Liberal Prime Minister, balance the budget that was balanced all the way back in 1995. Well, it turns out he didn't even live in Canada at that point. He lived in Hong Kong working for Goldman Sachs. Okay. He didn't come back and he didn't start working for the Canadian Civil Service until the very, very, very end of Paul Martin's time in office. Next lie, he says that he had resigned from all of his positions, all of his board positions. He says, I have resigned from all of my board positions, full stop. This was on January 16th, 2025. I think we have a little clip of that. Let's play that.
I have resigned all my positions. I resigned all my positions, full stop, all in for Canada.
Full stop, all in for Canada. Whoops, a few days later, the National Post is reporting that it's not actually the case, that they spoke with numerous organizations that Carney had been affiliated with, and that he remains involved in at least 5 of these different organizations. Juno News follows up and points out that, for instance, Mark Carney's name and face was still active on a group called the Global Carbon Marketing Utilities page. Mark Carney was still listed as a co-chair of that organization up until the weekend. I think after we put our story up, they tried to take that down and wipe it. But again, examples of him not doing what he says. This is just the tip of the iceberg. He also said, of course, the sort of the most famous example at this point of him just not being honest with Canadians. He said that he had nothing to do with Brookfield Asset Management's decision to leave Canada and relocate to the United States. And yet we found out that he actually wrote a letter urging shareholders to vote in favor of it. And the only reason he wasn't there was just a technicality, because the technical vote happened a few days after he had resigned. But basically the decision was already made. I mean, again, like, there's just nonstop. He was out there claiming that Canada supplies almost all of the semiconductors to the United States, saying that we do the vast majority. It turns out we're like a very, very small percentage of it. He said that he helped save Canada during the financial crisis in 2008. And Stephen Harper, the prime minister, came out quite strongly and basically accused him of taking credit for the late Jim Flaherty and the role that Jim Flaherty played. He's the one that made the tough choices, the tough calls. Mark Carney was lurking in the background, but to say that Mark Carney was the one that saved Canada is absolutely insulting to the Conservatives who did the hard work, who made the tough decisions, who had to face an electorate that wasn't necessarily happy about this. So Carney just has this crazy habit of taking credit for all kinds of things that it turns out he didn't actually do. And the biggest concern to me, Sean, is that this is all happening. I just came up with 9 examples in the past few months. And yet this is not the news that Canadians are getting. Canadians aren't seeing this information. They're not learning these facts because the legacy media is doing a complete disservice by trying to paint Mark Carney as a knight in shining armor, swooping in to save Canada from yet another crisis.
Yeah. I don't know what to add to it, honestly. Like, you see a guy who's willing to do whatever he can to gain power, and that person scares me. I'm not a fan of most politicians, not because I say politicians, not because of a single person, just because of what getting into those offices does to people. There's power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, I think is the saying. And anyone willing to lie that much to get in, and it does not faze him, and he will not take questions from alternative media to registered media. Like, this has been, like, we're having the same conversation we've been having now for at least 4 years, if not 5, and I'm just new to it. So maybe it's been 20 for all I know. You know, when I sit and talk to Chris Sims about some of these things, this isn't new. So although to some it might be shocking, this is just more the game plan they've been doing. You know, like, from my new eyes to politics, and Candace, you've been staring at this a lot longer than I have. Is it a new idea to say one thing in English and a different thing in French? I think the answer is no. Is it a new idea to travel to Western Canada and go, pipelines are great, we can't wait, and then go back to Quebec and say, we'll never build one? No, it isn't. What's different is we finally have media like just blossoming all over this country. It's starting to point it out. And then with, once again, people can love and hate Elon Musk, but him taking over Twitter and now Facebook changing directions as well. This messaging isn't staying siloed. It's starting to spread across so that you can see the contradictions all over the place. And so he's a scary human being, right? I mean, like, I can't imagine having a full-blown guy connected to the globalist agenda that has been in play in front of us and just in front of me for my short time of staring at it. It's unnerving. I keep reiterating that. None of it just makes me laugh, because if I'm sitting anywhere listening to this and you're like, I haven't heard those 9 things. It's like, just go do like 10-minute dive into Mark Carney and realize what he's saying to people right now. And that should unnerve everybody. And my hope, the mainstream media in the States positioned it that there was no way Donald Trump was going to win the election. They positioned it that way. And then he won. And I haven't quite figured this out about Canada yet. And maybe you have an opinion on this. Is we're staring at this and they're positioning it the same way other countries have done on a leader that they obviously want. And my only question, I guess, to you is does that represent what the eastern population of the world, of Canada, actually thinks? Or is it kind of like the States, where they're telling a story, getting everybody worked up, and the voter turnout on election day, whenever that happens, will tell and paint a different story? What do you think, Candace?
I have a feeling that you're right. I think that there is some interest in Mark Carney and that the polls are starting to pick that up, but because he's new and because he's painted as this person who comes into crises and fixes things, right? And I think that on a surface level, Canadians, especially older Canadians who still are plugged in, unfortunately, to CBC and legacy media, they have that impression. But when you look beyond that and you see the issues facing Canadians, like just this issue of immigration in the GTA, like I don't talk to anybody from any community, right? Even immigrant communities, even people who came themselves, or first generation Canadians, they don't like what they see. They don't like what has happened under the Trudeau Liberals. And I think that that is something that remains incredibly strong. Now, Sean, we're going to continue this conversation over at junonews.com. We're going to cut off the show on X, on YouTube, and on Facebook. And for everyone who wants to come on and hear the rest of the show, we're going to talk about some spicy issues, including the latest with the transgender issue, which seems to be totally different in the United States than it is in Canada. It's like Canada's still stuck in this woke dystopia, while the Americans have finally moved back towards common sense. So we're going to continue that all over at junonews.com. I hope you will join us.